The corridors of St. Mary's Medical Center echoed with the hum of machines and the soft footfalls of staff moving from room to room. The sterile white walls of the rare disease unit seemed to swallow every sound, creating an environment both calm and unnerving. Evelyn Grant, a tall, poised nurse in her mid-30s, adjusted her navy scrubs, mentally preparing herself for another long shift. Her calm exterior belied the turmoil she often carried inside, a feeling of being watched, judged, and sometimes dismissed by her colleagues. She moved with purpose, her dark brown eyes scanning the chart of her next patient. Today, the rare disease unit was full of the usual suspects, patients battling conditions that even the best doctors struggled to fully understand. And here, Evelyn was in her element. Her deep empathy for her patients, coupled with her clinical expertise, made her one of the most trusted nurses in the unit. But not everyone saw it that way. "Grant," a voice called sharply behind her. Evelyn turned to face Dr. Richard Palmer, one of the hospital's most esteemed surgeons. His reputation preceded him, a brilliant, if not arrogant man in his late 40s. His blue eyes, once steely with confidence, now held a flicker of impatience as he approached Evelyn, holding a chart in his hand. "Have you checked the vitals on the patient in room 304? He asked, his tone clipped and efficient. "Yes, Dr. Palmer," Evelyn responded, her voice steady. "Her vitals are stable, but I noticed her blood pressure has been fluctuating more than usual. I think it might be worth—" "Leave the diagnosing to the doctors, Grant," Richard interrupted, his voice laced with condescension. "You're here to report, not to interpret." Evelyn bit her tongue, suppressing the familiar surge of frustration. This wasn't the first time Dr. Palmer had dismissed her input, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Despite her years of experience and the respect she had earned from other doctors and patients, Dr. Palmer never missed an opportunity to remind her of her place. "Of course, doctor," Evelyn replied, keeping her voice even. She turned back to her work, her hands steady as she recorded the patient's vitals, though her thoughts were swirling. Every encounter with Dr. Palmer left her feeling small, diminished, as though her presence in the hospital was something to be tolerated rather than valued. Later that evening, after what felt like an endless shift, Evelyn walked through her neighborhood, the weight of the day still pressing heavily on her shoulders. The streets of the modest community were alive with the sounds of children playing and neighbors talking on their porches. It was a world so different from the pristine, sterile environment of St. Mary's. But this place felt like home. Evelyn reached her small, tidy house, where the soft light in the window welcomed her. As she stepped inside, the familiar scent of herbal tea filled the air, bringing with it a sense of comfort. Sitting in her favorite chair was her grandmother, Margaret, a strong woman with wise eyes, her hands busy knitting a blanket. "Long day?" Margaret asked without looking up, her voice warm and knowing. Evelyn sighed as she sank into the chair opposite her. "Dr. Palmer again," she muttered. "No matter what I do, he looks down on me. It's like he can't even see past his own arrogance." Margaret paused her knitting and looked up, her gaze soft and understanding. "You're strong, Evelyn. Don't let his ignorance make you question your worth. You've worked too hard to get where you are." Evelyn smiled weakly, her frustration evident in her voice. "I try, Grandma, but it's hard when every day feels like a battle. I'm not sure how much longer I can do this." Margaret reached over, placing her hand gently on Evelyn's. "You were meant for this work. He might not see it, but that doesn't mean you're not making a difference. You have something he lacks." "What's that?" Evelyn asked, though she already knew the answer. "Compassion." Evelyn nodded slowly, the words comforting her in a way that only Margaret's wisdom could. She knew her grandmother was right, but it didn't erase the sting of being constantly belittled. Tomorrow would come, and with it, another long shift under the critical eye of Dr. Palmer. Across town, Dr. Richard Palmer sat in the cold, expansive dining room of his house, the quiet almost deafening. The grandiose home, with its towering ceilings and expensive decor, felt more like a museum than a place of warmth. The only other occupant at the table was his teenage daughter, Rachel, who sat across from him, silently picking at her dinner. "Dad, I've been feeling strange lately," Rachel began tentatively, her eyes flickering up to meet his. Richard barely glanced at her, his attention fixed on his phone. "Strange how?" "I've been really tired, and sometimes I get dizzy." Rachel continued, her voice tinged with concern. Teenagers go through phases, Richard replied dismissively, already scrolling through an email from the hospital. You're probably just overdoing it at school. Rachel's face fell, her words dying in her throat. She had long since learned that her father's attention was fleeting, always reserved for his work. With a sigh, she excused herself from the table, heading to her room with a growing sense of dread that something was seriously wrong. Richard, meanwhile, continued eating in silence, unaware of the storm that was about to engulf his carefully controlled world. The next morning, the usual rhythm of the hospital was shattered when the emergency alarms blared through the rare disease unit. Evelyn rushed toward the commotion, her heart pounding as she reached the emergency ward. To her shock, Rachel Palmer was being wheeled in on a stretcher, her face pale and her breathing shallow. "Rachel!" Dr. Palmer's voice rang out as he burst into the room, his calm composure shattered by fear. He barked orders at the nurses, his usual arrogance replaced by raw panic. Evelyn instinctively stepped forward, glancing at Rachel's vitals. "Her blood pressure is dangerously low. We need to stabilize her now, or we'll lose her." "I know that," Richard snapped, his voice harsh, though his eyes betrayed his fear. But he hesitated. This was beyond his expertise, and he knew it. The situation was slipping out of his control. "She needs immediate care for her underlying condition," Evelyn pressed, her voice calm but firm. "Let me help." For the first time, Richard faltered, his pride warred with the terror of losing his daughter. Finally, with a tight nod, he stepped aside. "Do it," he muttered. Evelyn moved quickly, gathering the necessary medications and coordinating with the other nurses. Rachel's breathing was shallow, her pulse erratic, but Evelyn's hands were steady. The minutes stretched, each one filled with the weight of Rachel's fragile life hanging in the balance. As Rachel's condition slowly stabilized, the tension in the room eased slightly. Richard stood by, his fists clenched at his sides, helpless for the first time in his career. He had never felt so powerless, and watching Evelyn command the room with quiet confidence only deepened the pit in his stomach. Evelyn took a deep breath, stepping back from Rachel's bedside. "She's stable for now, but we'll need to monitor her closely." Dr. Palmer looked at her, his expression unreadable. For the first time in their years of working together, he didn't have a single remark to cut her down. Instead, he simply nodded. "Thank you," he said stiffly, the words unfamiliar and heavy on his tongue. Evelyn met his gaze, her exhaustion evident. "It's my job, doctor," she replied quietly before turning back to Rachel, her mind already focused on the next step in the battle to save the young girl's life. Evelyn sat in the dimly lit break room, sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee. Her mind replayed the events of the past few hours, her thoughts clouded with exhaustion. Rachel was stable for now, but the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on her shoulders. The machines in Rachel's room were doing the work of keeping her alive, but for how long? Her mind drifted to Dr. Palmer. She had seen a crack in his usually impenetrable facade today, a glimpse of the man behind the arrogance. For the first time, he had shown fear, real, human fear. It had almost been enough to make her feel sorry for him. Almost. Evelyn wasn't naive. She knew that as soon as Rachel's condition stabilized, Richard Palmer would likely return to his old ways, dismissing her expertise, refusing to acknowledge her contributions. It wasn't just him either. The hospital system was built to favor people like him, white, male, powerful, while people like her had to work twice as hard just to be seen. The door to the break room creaked open, and Nurse Carla, one of Evelyn's closest friends in the unit, stepped inside. Her brown hair was pulled into a messy bun, and the fatigue in her eyes mirrored Evelyn's own. "How's she doing?" Carla asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee and sitting across from Evelyn. "Stable, for now," Evelyn replied, her voice heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "But it's a rare condition. We're not out of the woods yet." Carla took a sip of her coffee and sighed. "And Dr. Palmer? Has he given you any trouble?" "Surprisingly, no," Evelyn said, setting her cup down. "He's different. I think he's finally realizing that he can't control everything, not even his daughter's health." Carla raised an eyebrow, leaning back in her chair. "It's about time someone knocked him off his pedestal." Evelyn nodded, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. "I don't know. It's strange. He's so used to being in control, And now that he's not, I almost feel bad for him. Don't, Carla said firmly, her voice cutting through the quiet of the room. Don't start feeling sorry for him. He's made his choices, and he's treated you horribly for years. Just because his world is falling apart doesn't erase all of that. I know, Evelyn admitted, but I also know what it's like to feel powerless. Carla sighed, standing and stretching her arms above her head. Well, don't forget, you're not powerless. You're the one keeping that girl alive. Don't let anyone, especially him, make you feel otherwise. Evelyn smiled faintly, grateful for the reminder. Thanks, Carla. I just hope this changes something. For her sake, and for his. Back in Rachel's hospital room, Dr. Richard Palmer sat in a chair by her bedside, his elbows resting on his knees, his fingers running through his silvering hair. The steady beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound in the room, a constant reminder of his daughter's fragility. Richard had never felt so helpless in his life. For decades, he had been the one in control. In the operating room, his word was law. His hands had saved countless lives, and his reputation as a surgeon was nearly untouchable. But none of that mattered now. Sitting in this sterile room, watching his daughter fight for her life, Richard realized how little power he actually had. He leaned forward, staring at Rachel's pale face, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow but steady. She had always been strong, just like her mother. Elizabeth had been his rock, the one person who had understood the pressure he was under. Losing her had almost broken him, and now he feared losing Rachel would finish the job. A quiet knock on the door broke through his thoughts. He looked up to see Evelyn stepping inside, her gaze immediately going to the monitors. "How is she doing?" Richard asked, his voice rough from lack of sleep. Evelyn moved to Rachel's side, checking her vitals. "She's holding steady for now. No new complications, but we'll need to keep monitoring her closely." Richard nodded, his gaze never leaving his daughter's face. "I don't know what I'd do if I lost her," he muttered, more to himself than to Evelyn. For a moment, Evelyn hesitated, unsure whether to respond. She wasn't used to seeing this side of him. Vulnerable, scared, human. Finally, she spoke softly. "We're doing everything we can. She's strong, Dr. Palmer, just like her mother." Richard's eyes flicked toward Evelyn, surprised by her gentle tone. He hadn't heard anyone mention Elizabeth in years. Most people avoided the subject, knowing how raw the wound still was. But there was something in Evelyn's voice, something that told him she understood his pain in a way others didn't. "I've never been good at admitting when I'm wrong," Richard said quietly, his eyes returning to Rachel. "But I was wrong about you." Evelyn blinked, startled by the sudden admission. She had spent years enduring his arrogance, his dismissive attitude, and now he was admitting fault. "We all make mistakes, Doctor," Evelyn replied cautiously, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "What matters is what we do to fix them." Richard didn't respond immediately. He knew she was right, but that didn't make it any easier to face. He had spent so long building walls around himself, walls of arrogance and superiority. But now, sitting here in this room, watching his daughter's life hang in the balance, those walls felt like they were crumbling around him. The next morning, just as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds in Rachel's room, the heart monitor let out a piercing alarm. Evelyn and Richard both jumped to their feet, rushing to Rachel's side. Her vitals were crashing. "We need to intubate her now," Evelyn shouted, grabbing the necessary equipment. Richard moved to help, his hands trembling as he reached for the intubation tube. He had performed this procedure hundreds of times, but now, standing at his daughter's bedside, his mind was a blur of fear and panic. Evelyn's hands were steady as she worked, her focus unshakable despite the chaos. Sweat dripped down her forehead, but she didn't waver. "Come on, Rachel," she muttered under her breath. "Stay with us." After what felt like an eternity, Rachel's vitals began to stabilize. The tension in the room eased slightly, but the air was still thick with uncertainty. "She's critical, but her airway is secure for now," Evelyn said, stepping back and wiping the sweat from her brow. "We need to move fast. Her body's rejecting the treatment." Richard's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. How could this be happening? Just yesterday, Rachel had been stable. Now everything was falling apart. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice shaking. Evelyn didn't hesitate. There's a new medication we can try, but it's risky. It could strain her heart, but without it, she won't survive the next few hours. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes flicking between Rachel and Evelyn. Risky how? It's a chance we have to take, Evelyn said firmly. But the decision is yours. For a long moment, Richard stared at his daughter, his mind a tangled mess of fear and desperation. He had spent his entire career making life or death decisions, but this was different. This was his little girl. Finally, he nodded. Do it, he whispered, his voice hollow. We have no other option. After administering the new treatment, Evelyn and the rest of the medical team watched Rachel's vitals closely. The room was silent except for the steady beep of the heart monitor, each sound carrying the weight of Rachel's life. Hours passed, each one feeling longer than the last. Richard paced the floor outside Rachel's room, unable to sit still, his mind racing with thoughts of what might happen if the treatment didn't work. Evelyn watched him from inside the room, her eyes filled with exhaustion and empathy. She had seen this before, the way fear could tear a person apart. But something about Richard's fear was different. It was raw, unfiltered, and completely outside of the carefully constructed persona he had maintained for years. Finally, Rachel's vitals began to improve. Her heart rate steadied and her breathing became less labored. The room, which had been thick with tension, began to feel lighter. She's responding to the treatment, Evelyn said quietly, her voice filled with relief. We're not out of the woods yet, but it's a good sign. Richard stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto Evelyn's. For the first time, there was a glimmer of hope in his gaze. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I couldn't have done this without you. Evelyn smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident. It's not over yet, Doctor Palmer, but we're getting there. As she left the room to give Richard some time alone with his daughter, Evelyn couldn't help but feel that something had shifted between them. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she felt like they were fighting it together. Evelyn returned to the nurse's station, the weight of exhaustion pressing on her. The rare disease unit was always intense, but nothing compared to the stakes of the last few days. Rachel's condition had improved, yet Evelyn knew it was temporary. The battle was far from over. She leaned against the counter, her fingers rubbing her temples. She needed a break, a moment to breathe. But there was no time. Not with Rachel's condition teetering on the edge. Hey, you okay? Carla's voice broke through Evelyn's thoughts as she approached, her brow furrowed in concern. I'm fine, Evelyn replied, though the words felt hollow. Just a lot to handle right now. I don't know how you're keeping it together, Carla said, leaning on the counter beside her. Rachel's case, Palmer's constant hovering. It's enough to drive anyone crazy. Evelyn let out a long breath. He's different now. Not the same arrogant man he used to be. He's scared. Carla nodded. Fear will do that to people. But don't forget, you're the one holding this together, Evelyn, not him. I know, Evelyn said softly, glancing down the hall towards Rachel's room. But it's hard not to feel the weight of all this. Carla squeezed her shoulder gently. Take care of yourself, okay? You're not alone in this. Evelyn gave her a weak smile, grateful for the support, though the pressure on her shoulders felt heavier than ever. Inside Rachel's room, Richard Palmer sat at his daughter's bedside, his head in his hands. The faint sound of the machines monitoring Rachel's vitals drummed steadily in the background, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed with thoughts of regret, of fear, of everything he couldn't control. For years, Richard had built his life on control. Control of his career, control of his reputation, control over every decision in the operating room. But now, all of that control had slipped through his fingers. He looked at Rachel, her face still pale and fragile, her body covered with the machines keeping her alive. She was his only child, the one constant in his life after Elizabeth's death. And now, he might lose her too. A soft knock on the door drew his attention. Evelyn stood in the doorway, holding a clipboard, her expression calm but serious. How is she? Richard asked, his voice hoarse. She's stable for now, Evelyn replied, stepping inside to check Rachel's chart. But we need to be prepared for the possibility of another complication. Richard clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. What kind of complication? Evelyn hesitated for a moment, meeting his gaze. Her condition is unpredictable, Doctor. Palmer, we're doing everything we can, but the disease is progressing. If things worsen again, we may need to consider more aggressive intervention. Richard's heart sank. Aggressive how? Surgery, Evelyn said, her voice calm but firm. If the disease begins affecting her lungs or heart, we'll need to relieve the pressure. But it's very risky. Richard's stomach churned at the thought. Surgery? On Rachel? He had performed countless surgeries in his career, but the thought of his daughter being on that table, her life in someone else's hands, it was too much to bear. I need to be there, Richard said suddenly, his voice rising. If she needs surgery, I'm going to be the one operating. Evelyn shook her head, her tone gentle but unwavering. You can't, Richard. You're her father, not her surgeon. You're too close to this. Richard's jaw tightened, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. She's my daughter, Evelyn. I need to be in that room. Evelyn took a deep breath, her expression softening as she spoke. I understand how you feel, but you have to trust the team. You have to trust me. We'll take care of her. For a long moment, Richard didn't respond. His fists remained clenched, his chest tight with a mix of fear and anger. But deep down, he knew Evelyn was right. He wasn't thinking clearly. His judgment was clouded by his emotions. Finally, with a sharp exhale, he nodded. Fine, he muttered. But if anything happens, we won't let that happen, Evelyn said, her voice steady and reassuring. I promise. Later that evening, the hospital was quieter, but the tension still hung in the air. Evelyn had just finished reviewing a patient's chart when the alarms went off again. Her heart leaped into her throat as she rushed down the hall toward Rachel's room, fear gripping her chest. Inside, chaos had already erupted. Rachel's vitals were plummeting, and her breathing was shallow and erratic. Richard stood by her bedside, his hands trembling as he watched the monitors in horror. Her heart rate is dropping, Evelyn shouted, immediately checking the equipment. We need to intubate again, and fast. Richard moved to help, but his hands shook uncontrollably. He had performed this procedure hundreds of times, but now, seeing his daughter on the brink of death, he couldn't focus. Step back, Evelyn said firmly, her hands moving with precision as she took control of the situation. I need space. Richard hesitated, fear and helplessness crashing over him in waves. But he knew Evelyn was the only one who could save Rachel now. Reluctantly, he stepped back, his eyes never leaving his daughter's face. Evelyn's hands were steady as she worked, the minutes stretching painfully long as she fought to stabilize Rachel. Sweat dripped down her forehead, but she didn't waver. The room was silent except for the beeping of the machines and the sound of her own rapid breathing. Finally, Rachel's vitals began to stabilize. The beeping of the heart monitor slowed, returning to a more regular rhythm. Evelyn let out a long, shaky breath, stepping back from the bed. She's stable again, Evelyn said quietly, her voice thick with exhaustion. But we need to move fast. Her body is rejecting the treatment. We have to act now. Richard stared at her, his mind racing. What do you mean? What are our options? Surgery, Evelyn replied, her voice grim. It's the only way to relieve the pressure on her lungs, but it's high risk. We could lose her on the table. Richard felt the ground beneath him begin to crumble. Surgery. The word echoed in his mind, louder and more terrifying than anything he'd ever faced in the operating room. Do it, Richard said finally, his voice hollow. We have no choice. The surgical prep room was cold and sterile, the air thick with tension as the medical team prepared for Rachel's operation. Evelyn stood at the sink, scrubbing in, her mind racing with every possible complication, every potential outcome. There was no room for error, not today. Richard hovered nearby, his usually calm demeanor replaced by a palpable sense of fear. His eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep, his hands trembling at his sides. I don't know if I can do this, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn glanced at him, her eyes soft but firm. You don't have to. You just have to trust us. We'll take care of her. Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. He had never felt so powerless in his life. For years, he had been the one in control, the one making the decisions. But now, he was forced to trust someone else. And for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he could handle it. I trust you, Richard said finally, his voice breaking slightly. I trust you, Evelyn. Evelyn gave him a brief, reassuring nod before turning toward the operating room. "Let's go save your daughter." The surgery was long and grueling, every minute stretching painfully as the team worked with meticulous precision. Evelyn led the operation, her focus laser-sharp, her hands moving with the kind of confidence that only came from years of experience. Richard watched from the observation window, his heart pounding in his chest. He had performed countless surgeries, but nothing had ever felt as terrifying as this. Watching his daughter's life hang in the balance, completely out of his control. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Evelyn stepped out of the operating room, her face drawn and tired but calm. "She made it," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with quiet relief. "She's stable, but we're not out of the woods yet. The next 48 hours are critical." Richard's knees nearly buckled as the weight of her words hit him. He let out a shaky breath, his hands gripping the edge of the counter to steady himself. "Thank God," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for saving her." Evelyn smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident. "It's not over yet. But she's a fighter, Doctor. Palmer, just like you." As she walked away, the tension between them felt different, softer, less jagged. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, but for the first time, Richard felt a glimmer of hope. He knew that the battle wasn't just about Rachel's survival. It was about something deeper, about the walls he had built around himself, the arrogance that had blinded him for so long. And now, with Rachel's life hanging in the balance, those walls were starting to crumble. The hospital halls were quiet, with only the distant hum of machines and the occasional soft footsteps of night shift staff breaking the silence. Richard sat in the chair beside Rachel's bed, his eyes fixed on the steady rise and fall of her chest. The beeping of the heart monitor was almost soothing now, a reminder that, for the moment, she was still here. She had made it through the surgery, but the fight was far from over. Rachel's face, pale and framed by the tubes and wires keeping her alive, looked fragile. She had always been his strength, a reminder of Elizabeth's fierce spirit, and now Richard was terrified of losing her, just as he had lost her mother. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands running through his hair. Exhaustion pulled at every fiber of his being, but he couldn't leave. He couldn't let go of her hand, as if the simple act of holding on to her would somehow keep her tethered to life. The door creaked open, and Evelyn stepped into the room quietly, her movements gentle as she checked Rachel's monitors. Richard glanced up at her, his eyes bloodshot and hollow. "How's she doing?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She's stable," Evelyn replied softly. "The next 24 hours will be crucial, but she's strong. We'll keep a close eye on her." Richard nodded, his gaze returning to Rachel. "I can't lose her, Evelyn. She's all I have left." Evelyn hesitated, then stepped closer, her voice quiet but filled with compassion. "You won't lose her. We're doing everything we can, and she's a fighter, just like you." Richard shook his head, his voice breaking. "I'm not strong, Evelyn. Not like her. Not like you." Evelyn studied him for a moment, her expression softening. She had never seen him like this. So vulnerable, so raw. The arrogant, untouchable doctor she had known for years was gone, replaced by a father terrified of losing his child. It stirred something deep inside her, a compassion she hadn't expected to feel for him. "You've been through a lot," she said gently, "but strength doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like letting go." Richard's hands tightened around Rachel's, his knuckles white. "I don't know how to let go. I've spent my whole life controlling everything, and now—" His voice trailed off, thick with emotion. Evelyn took a deep breath, her own exhaustion pressing heavily on her. "You don't have to do this alone, Richard. Let me help." For a long moment, Richard didn't respond. His chest heaved with the weight of emotions he had been holding in for so long. Finally, he nodded, his voice barely audible. "I don't know what I'd do without you, Evelyn." Hours later, Evelyn found herself back in the break room, the quiet hum of the hospital barely cutting through her exhaustion. She sat at the small table, her head resting in her hands, her thoughts swirling. The events of the past few days had taken a toll on her, and now, in the stillness of the night, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Rachel was stable, but the road ahead was uncertain. The surgery had been successful, but her condition was still fragile. Every minute, every decision felt like a tightrope walk, balancing between hope and despair. Evelyn's thoughts drifted to Richard. His transformation over the past few days had been profound. The man she had once seen as cold, arrogant, and unapproachable had crumbled, revealing a depth of fear and vulnerability she hadn't thought possible. She had seen glimpses of this before, in the way he spoke about Elizabeth, in the way he looked at Rachel. But now those glimpses had become something more, a man desperate to hold on to the last piece of his family. Carla stepped into the room, her face lined with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with concern. "Hey, how's Rachel?" "Stable," Evelyn replied, her voice heavy. "But it's touch and go. We won't know for sure for another day or two." Carla nodded, pouring herself a cup of coffee and sitting across from Evelyn. "And Richard? Is he still in meltdown mode?" Evelyn let out a long breath, leaning back in her chair. "He's different now. I think he's finally starting to realize that he can't control everything, and it's breaking him." Carla raised an eyebrow. "Good. He needed to be taken down a peg." "I don't know," Evelyn said softly, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "I think it's more than that. He's not just losing control, he's losing his daughter. He's lost so much already." Carla studied her for a moment, her brow furrowed. "You're feeling sorry for him?" Evelyn shook her head. "Not exactly, but I understand what it's like to feel powerless, to watch someone you love slip away and know there's nothing you can do to stop it." Carla nodded slowly, her expression softening. "I get it. But don't forget, you're the one holding everything together. Without you, Rachel wouldn't have made it this far. He wouldn't have made it this far." Evelyn smiled weakly. "I'm just doing my job." Carla leaned forward, her eyes locked on Evelyn's. "No, you're doing more than that. You've been carrying this entire situation on your shoulders. And I think Richard knows that, even if he hasn't said it." Evelyn nodded, though the exhaustion in her bones made it hard to feel any sense of accomplishment. "I hope so, for Rachel's sake." The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the blinds, the hospital's quiet calm was shattered by the sudden blare of alarms in Rachel's room. Evelyn rushed down the hall, her heart racing, her mind already calculating the next steps. Inside the room, Richard stood frozen, his face pale as he stared at the monitors. Rachel's vitals had plummeted again, her heart rate dropping dangerously low. "We need to move quickly," Evelyn shouted, grabbing the necessary equipment as the medical team rushed in. "Her body isn't responding to the treatment." Richard's hands trembled as he watched Evelyn take control of the situation. Sweat dripped down his forehead, his chest tightening with fear. He had been in this position before, watching Elizabeth fade away, unable to do anything to save her. Now it was happening again, and the helplessness was unbearable. "Evelyn, what do we do?" he asked, his voice cracking with desperation. "We need to act now," Evelyn said firmly. "She's not responding to the medication. We'll need to adjust the treatment plan, but it's risky. It could put too much strain on her heart." Richard's stomach churned, his mind racing. Another risky procedure, another chance he could lose her. "What's the alternative?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "There isn't one," Evelyn replied, her tone grim. "If we don't do this, she won't survive." For a moment, Richard felt the room spin, the walls closing in around him. He had spent years controlling every aspect of his life, every decision in the operating room, every move in his career. But now all of that control was gone. He was at the mercy of forces he couldn't control, and it terrified him. "Do it," he whispered, his voice hollow. "Save her." The hours that followed were a blur of tension and exhaustion as the medical team worked to stabilize Rachel. Evelyn led the charge, her hands steady, her mind focused. But the strain was beginning to show. Every minute felt like a battle, every decision a gamble. Richard paced the floor outside the room, his heart pounding in his chest, his thoughts a tangled mess of fear, guilt, and regret. He had spent so long building walls around himself, hiding behind his arrogance and control, that he hadn't realized how fragile it all was. Now, as he watched his daughter fight for her life, those walls were crumbling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Evelyn stepped out of the room, her face drawn and tired, but calm. "She's stable," Evelyn said softly, her voice thick with exhaustion. But it was too close. Richard let out a long, shaky breath, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with raw emotion. "I don't know how to thank you enough." Evelyn met his gaze, her own exhaustion evident in her eyes. "You don't have to. We're all in this together." Richard nodded, though the guilt still gnawed at him. "I've been awful to you, Evelyn. I've treated you like you weren't good enough, like you didn't belong here. And now, you're the only one who can save her." Evelyn blinked, surprised by the admission. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. She had spent years enduring his arrogance, his dismissive attitude, and now standing here, hearing him acknowledge his mistakes, it felt surreal. "We all make mistakes," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with quiet understanding. "What matters is how we fix them." Richard swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know how to fix this." Evelyn gave him a small, tired smile. "It's not about fixing everything. It's about letting go. Trust me, Richard. We'll get through this." The next few hours passed in a blur of tension and cautious hope. Rachel remained stable, her condition delicately balanced as the team monitored her closely. Evelyn moved through the hospital with a quiet, steady focus. But inside, the weight of the situation was beginning to wear on her. Every decision, every adjustment to Rachel's care felt like a small victory, but they were walking a fine line, and she knew it wouldn't last forever. Evelyn found a rare moment to step outside and take a breath. The cool evening air was a welcome relief from the sterile environment of the hospital. She closed her eyes, letting the breeze wash over her, if only for a moment. But even out here, away from the machines and the beeping monitors, her mind couldn't let go of Rachel, of Richard, and of everything that had happened. She knew that Richard was struggling. His walls were crumbling, and for the first time, he was allowing himself to feel the fear, the uncertainty. It was a necessary step, but it also made him more vulnerable than she had ever seen him. And for all his faults, she couldn't help but feel for him. He was a father fighting for his daughter's life, just as she was fighting for her patience. As she turned to go back inside, she saw Richard standing by the door, his face pale and drawn, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I couldn't stay in there any longer." Evelyn nodded, understanding. "It's okay. Sometimes we need a moment to breathe." Richard hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer, his gaze searching hers. "How do you do it?" he asked softly. "How do you stay so calm when everything feels like it's falling apart?" Evelyn took a deep breath, her eyes drifting over the city skyline. "I don't always feel calm, but I've learned that panic doesn't help. It only clouds your judgment. You focus on what you can control, and you trust that you're doing everything you can." Richard looked down, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I don't know how to let go of that control. I've spent my whole life trying to control everything, and now I feel like I'm failing her. I wasn't there for Elizabeth, and now I'm failing Rachel too." Evelyn's heart ached for him, seeing the raw pain in his expression. She stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "You're not failing her, Richard. You're here. You're fighting for her. That's all that matters." He swallowed hard, his throat tight with emotion. "I don't know how to be anything other than a surgeon, Evelyn. I don't know how to be a father." Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes filled with compassion. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be there for her." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of Richard's words hanging between them. He had spent so long hiding behind his career, behind the walls he had built around himself, that he had forgotten how to be vulnerable, how to let people in. But now, as he faced the possibility of losing Rachel, those walls were finally beginning to fall. The calm didn't last long. Just as dawn broke over the hospital, the alarms in Rachel's room began blaring again. Evelyn rushed down the hall, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing with the possibilities. Inside, Richard stood frozen, his face pale as he watched the monitors flash dangerously low numbers. "Her vitals are crashing," Evelyn shouted, grabbing the necessary equipment as the team swarmed into the room. "We need to intubate again now." Richard moved to help, but his hands trembled uncontrollably. His mind was a blur of fear and panic, the walls he had spent so long building around himself crumbling even further. Evelyn's hands moved with the precision and calm she was known for, but inside she could feel the tension rising. Rachel's body was rejecting the treatment again, and there were no guarantees that this time they would be able to save her. "Come on, Rachel," Evelyn muttered under her breath as she worked, her eyes focused on the task at hand. "Stay with us." The minutes stretched painfully long as Evelyn and the team worked to stabilize Rachel, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. Richard stood by helplessly, his fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding in his chest. Finally, Rachel's vitals began to stabilize, the beeping of the heart monitor slowing to a more regular rhythm. Evelyn let out a long breath, stepping back from the bed, her hands shaking from the intensity of the moment. "She's stable again," Evelyn said quietly, her voice thick with exhaustion. "But we need to move fast. Her body is rejecting the treatment. We have to act now." Richard stared at her, his mind spinning. "What do you mean? What are our options?" "Surgery," Evelyn replied, her voice calm but grim. "We need to go back in. This is our last chance." Richard's heart sank. Another surgery, another risk. He had trusted Evelyn once, and she had saved Rachel. But now the stakes felt even higher. "I'll be there," Richard said, his voice shaking. "I'm not leaving her this time." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression soft but firm. "Richard, you know you can't be in the operating room. You're too close to this. You need to trust us." Richard clenched his fists, his jaw tight with frustration. "She's my daughter, Evelyn. I can't just stand by and do nothing." "You won't be doing nothing," Evelyn said, stepping closer. "You'll be trusting the people who are here to help her. You'll be trusting me." For a long moment, Richard didn't respond. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing with fear and desperation. But deep down, he knew Evelyn was right. He couldn't control this. He couldn't save her. He had to let go. Finally, with a shaky breath, he nodded. "Okay," he whispered. "I trust you." The operating room was a flurry of activity as the surgical team prepared for the procedure. Evelyn scrubbed in, her mind racing with every possible complication, every potential outcome. There was no room for error. Rachel's life was hanging in the balance, and Evelyn was determined to save her. Richard stood outside the observation window, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding in front of him. He had spent his entire career in this position, controlling every aspect of the surgeries he performed. But now, as he watched his daughter on the operating table, he had never felt so powerless. Evelyn worked with a quiet intensity, her hands moving with precision and confidence. Every decision, every movement was calculated, but the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her shoulders. She knew how much this meant, not just to Rachel, but to Richard as well. She couldn't fail. Not now. Hours passed, each one stretching longer than the last. Richard paced the floor outside the observation window, his stomach in knots, his heart pounding with fear. The thought of losing Rachel was unbearable, and the helplessness gnawed at him relentlessly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Evelyn emerged from the operating room, her face drawn with exhaustion but calm. "She made it," Evelyn said softly, her voice filled with quiet relief. "She's stable, but the next 24 hours will be critical." Richard let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his knees nearly giving out beneath him. "Thank God," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Evelyn. Thank you for saving her." Evelyn smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident. "It's not over yet, but she's a fighter, Richard. Just like you." Richard nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had spent so long believing that he had to control everything, that he had to be the one to save her. But now, as he looked at Evelyn, he realized that sometimes strength meant letting go. Sometimes it meant trusting someone else. The next 24 hours were a blur of tension and hope as Rachel's condition slowly improved. Her vitals stabilized, and the color began to return to her face. Evelyn monitored her closely, checking the machines, adjusting her medications, and watching for any sign of a relapse. Richard stayed by Rachel's bedside, his hand holding hers, his heart filled with a mixture of relief and fear. He hadn't left her side since the surgery, unable to tear himself away from the daughter he had almost lost. As the hours passed, the tension in the room began to lift. Rachel's breathing became steadier, her heart rate more regular. The worst of the crisis seemed to be over. Evelyn stepped into the room, her expression soft but tired. "She's doing well," she said quietly. "The next few days will be important, but I think she's going to make it." Richard looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you, Evelyn," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved her." Evelyn smiled faintly, her exhaustion evident. "It wasn't just me. It was a team effort." Richard shook his head, his eyes locked on hers. "No, Evelyn, it was you. You've done more than just your job. You've given me back my daughter." For a long moment they stood in silence, the weight of everything that had happened hanging between them. The crisis had brought them to the edge, but now, on the other side, something had shifted. The barriers between them had begun to fall, and in their place something new was growing, a mutual respect, a deeper understanding. As Evelyn left the room to give Richard some time alone with Rachel, she felt a sense of relief wash over her. The worst was behind them, but the journey was far from over. And now, for the first time, she felt like they were walking it together. 2 days had passed since Rachel's surgery, and the hospital room was finally quiet. The constant alarms and frantic rush of nurses had been replaced by the steady hum of machines that now monitored Rachel's improving condition. Richard sat at her bedside, his heart swelling with cautious hope as he watched her sleep. Evelyn entered the room, her steps quiet, her gaze immediately going to the monitors. The vitals were steady, stronger than they had been in days. A wave of relief washed over her, though she kept her professional composure. "How is she?" Richard asked, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and hope. "She's doing well," Evelyn replied, her tone soft but firm. "Her vitals are stable, and the surgery went as well as we could have hoped. She'll need time to recover, but I think she's going to pull through." Richard exhaled deeply, the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time in what felt like weeks. "I can't tell you how much this means to me, Evelyn. I've never been so scared in my life." Evelyn nodded, understanding. "It's been a tough road, but Rachel's strong. She'll come out of this even stronger." Richard looked down at Rachel's hand, still resting gently in his. "I was so focused on controlling everything, on being perfect, that I forgot how fragile life really is. I've spent years building walls around myself, thinking I had to protect myself from pain, from failure. But those walls didn't protect me. They only isolated me." Evelyn remained silent, allowing Richard the space to reflect. "When Elizabeth died," Richard continued, his voice soft, "I thought I had to be strong for Rachel, that I had to be in control of everything. But the truth is, I've been running from the pain ever since. I've been a terrible father." Evelyn took a step closer, her voice gentle but steady. "You've been through a lot, Richard, but you're here now, and that's what matters." Richard met her gaze, his eyes filled with emotion. "I don't deserve your kindness, Evelyn. I've treated you horribly, and yet you've been nothing but compassionate. You saved Rachel's life, and you've shown me what true strength really is." Evelyn smiled faintly, the warmth in her eyes softening the weight of his words. "We've all made mistakes, Richard. What matters is how we move forward." Richard nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his guilt and arrogance begin to lift. He had spent so long trying to be perfect, to control everything, that he had forgotten the importance of vulnerability, of letting others in. And now, with Rachel safe and Evelyn by his side, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. As Rachel's condition continued to improve, Evelyn found herself reflecting on her own journey. The past few weeks had been some of the most challenging of her career, but they had also been some of the most rewarding. She had fought for Rachel's life, and in doing so had broken through the barriers that had stood between her and Richard for so long. Evelyn had always known that her work as a nurse was important, but for the first time, she felt a sense of validation that went beyond the walls of the hospital. She had earned the respect of someone who had once seen her as lesser, and more importantly, she had proven to herself that she was capable of handling whatever challenges came her way. But despite the victory, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. For years, she had dedicated herself entirely to her work, putting aside her own needs and desires to care for others. But now, as she watched Rachel's recovery, she wondered if it was time for her to focus on herself. Evelyn's grandmother, Margaret, had always told her that true strength came not from pushing through life's challenges, but from knowing when to rest, when to step back and care for herself. And now, standing at the crossroads of her career, Evelyn began to wonder if it was time to take that advice. Later that evening, Evelyn sat in the staff break room, her fingers wrapped around a warm cup of tea as she thought about the future. Carla, her ever-supportive friend, joined her, pulling up a chair beside her. "You've been quiet lately," Carla said, her tone light but probing. "What's on your mind?" Evelyn sighed, her gaze drifting out the window. "I've been thinking a lot about what's next. This has been such an intense few weeks, and I'm proud of what we've accomplished. But I'm also exhausted. I think it might be time for a change." Carla raised an eyebrow, her eyes curious. "What kind of change?" "I'm not sure yet," Evelyn admitted, "but I've been so focused on my work for so long that I've forgotten what it feels like to live for myself. Maybe it's time to take a break, to figure out what I really want." Carla nodded, understanding. "You deserve that, Evelyn. You've given so much of yourself to this hospital, to your patients. It's okay to take time for yourself." Evelyn smiled, grateful for Carla's unwavering support. "I don't know what the future holds, but for the first time in a long time, I'm excited to find out." The day finally came when Rachel was well enough to be discharged from the hospital. The mood was light, the tension that had hung over the room for so long finally lifting. Richard stood by the door, his heart swelling with gratitude as he watched Rachel, her face bright and healthy, preparing to leave the place where she had fought so hard to survive. Evelyn entered the room with a smile, her steps light as she approached Rachel. "How are we feeling today?" she asked, her tone cheerful. "Ready to get out of here," Rachel replied with a laugh. "I never thought I'd say this, but I've had enough of hospitals for a lifetime." Evelyn chuckled, her heart warming at the sight of Rachel's recovery. "I think that's a good sign. You're stronger than you know, Rachel." Rachel's smile softened as she looked at Evelyn, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here without you. Thank you, Evelyn, for everything." Evelyn's eyes glistened with emotion as she bent down to give Rachel a gentle hug. "It was a team effort," she said softly, "but I'm so proud of you. You've been through so much, and you came out the other side even stronger." Richard stood by, watching the exchange with a mixture of pride and gratitude. He had spent so long thinking he had to do everything on his own, that he had to control every aspect of his life. But now, seeing his daughter healthy and happy, he realized that letting go of that control had been the best decision he could have made. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Richard turned to Evelyn, his expression sincere. "Evelyn, I meant what I said before. You've done more than just your job. You've given me my daughter back, and I'll never be able to repay you for that." Evelyn smiled, her heart full. "You don't have to repay me, Richard. Just take care of her and take care of yourself." Richard nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I will. And if you ever need anything, I hope you know you can count on me." Evelyn met his gaze, the connection between them stronger than ever before. "Thank you, Richard. I appreciate that." As Richard and Rachel left the hospital, Evelyn stood by the entrance watching them go. The journey had been long and difficult, but now as she watched them walk away, she felt a sense of peace. She had faced her own battles, fought for what she believed in, and emerged stronger on the other side. And now, for the first time in a long time, she was ready for whatever came next. A week later, Evelyn found herself walking through the quiet halls of the hospital, reflecting on everything that had happened. Rachel's recovery had been a success, and Richard had transformed from the arrogant surgeon she had once known into a humbled, grateful father. As she passed the nurse's station, a familiar face appeared. Richard, looking more relaxed and at ease than she had ever seen him. He approached her with a smile, his demeanor warm and open. "I didn't expect to see you here," Evelyn said, surprised. "I just wanted to stop by," Richard replied, his tone light. "And I wanted to tell you something." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, curious. "What's that?" "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened," Richard began, his voice sincere. "And I've decided to make some changes in my life. I'm going to take some time off from surgery, focus on Rachel, and really be the father she deserves." Evelyn smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "That's a big decision, Richard. I think it's the right one." Richard nodded, his eyes soft. It wasn't an easy decision, but it's the right one. And I wanted to thank you for helping me see that. You've shown me what really matters. Evelyn felt a warmth spread through her, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. I'm glad to hear that, Richard. You deserve this time with her. As they stood there, the bond between them solidified. Evelyn knew that this was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. For both of them. They had faced their fears, overcome their challenges, and now they were ready to move forward. And whatever the future held, Evelyn was ready to embrace it. As Evelyn watched Richard and Rachel leave the hospital, a sense of calm settled over her. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had made it through, together. The challenges they had faced had changed all of them, showing that even in the darkest moments, there is room for hope, healing, and transformation. As Evelyn turned to leave, she smiled to herself, knowing that the lessons learned in these hospital walls would stay with her forever. She was ready for the future, whatever it held. Thank you for watching this story of redemption and healing. If you enjoyed watching Evelyn, Richard, and Rachel's emotional journey and want to see more stories about resilience, growth, and transformation, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't miss out on future stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us all of the power of compassion. Hit the subscribe button and stay tuned for more incredible journeys. Your support means the world to us.